Okay, I will now pass it over to Helen Yaffe. I really recommend, before I'll just plug her book again. We have these We Are Cuba books that came out last year, that is very, very useful, detailed analysis about how a revolutionary people survived in a post-Soviet world. And really, to understand what is happening in Cuba today, you just have to read this book. It lays it all out there, even though it wasn't written before the 11th of July. The background to the US attacks is all there. Also, I just want to mention that Helen has written for our newspaper, Fight Racism, Fight Imperialism, and there's a brilliant article by her about the July 11 and the kind of social media war on Cuba in the paper. You can get a copy from our stores, or we also have a digital copy, and I'm sure the links will be shared on the chat as well. So brilliant, thanks very much, and over to you, Helen.
Okay, thanks for that intro, Sam. I think it was almost as long as I intended to speak, but much appreciated. So I'm just going to whiz through a few points, and hopefully we can people can pick up on some of them for the discussion. Okay, so I was in Cuba on the 11th of July. I had arrived 5 days earlier and spent 5 days in quarantine, which is an obligation at this point. And I'm in Cuba to do work, and I left on the 11th of July, and I drove through a big part of Havana. I didn't see anything, only found out about the protests from the Cuban president, Miguel Díaz-Canel, when I was watching the Euro final championships, which England was playing in, and the broadcast was interrupted. So that's a very interesting aspect, that the Cuban population found out about protests that in many places where they took place turned violent by the president himself. And it showed footage of him going direct to San Antonio de los Baños, which is a sort of area on the outskirts of Havana where the protests seem to have started. And I've heard some very interesting things about how those were started. There was a Facebook page which was for residents of that barrio, and some of them were still there, and some of them have left or in the US. And apparently for quite a while, the area had suffered from a blackout, right? Electricity cut out. And that's, quite traumatic for anyone, but very traumatic in Cuba in the context of economic crisis, because it's so reminiscent of the hardships they suffered during the special period with the collapse of the Soviet bloc, and Cuba lost 35% of GDP, and blackouts, lasting 12 hours regularly, distributed fairly in a sense, were, a very, very difficult daily part of life. So there'd been these blackouts in San Antonio de los Baños, and people on this Facebook page from the US were encouraging those who were there in the region to go out and take to the streets. So, this protest happens, it's to do with, a meeting after church, and they start marching through the community, and the first protest goes violent. And of course, all Cubans are there with their phones, with their cameras, broadcasting direct, and then it starts to take off. But it's also worth saying, as Christina said, not so spontaneous. This is something they've been working a long time to achieve. Otherwise, how do you explain the coordination of slogans and so on? And actually, the demand of most of the protests was, as Christina says, an abstract thing of down of dictatorship, we want freedom, swearing at the president, rather than, we want food, we want better medicine, and the kind of demands that occur when working class people go out and have a spontaneous protest about their conditions. So I found out about it that way. Miguel Díaz-Canel went onto the television, and he did his most impassioned speech I've heard him do to this point, no notes or anything. And he recognized that Cubans are suffering from the daily hardships that are mostly externally imposed, first of all by the Trump sanctions, 243 new actions, coercive measures and sanctions against Cuba since the beginning of the Trump administration, but over 50 of those since the pandemic began, despite the UN and other organizations calling on countries to drop sanctions which affect a country's capacity to respond to the pandemic, which is exactly what's happened in Cuba. In addition, you've had the pandemic, And the pandemic has meant, because Cuba has dealt with it in a very rigid, sensible way from a epidemiological, I don't like saying that word, point of view, very strict disease control. There's been closing down of spaces in Cuba where people would normally go and network and communicate, political spaces, cultural spaces, artistic spaces, study spaces. So people haven't been going into schools and universities. And what this means is it amplifies these messages that are being that Cubans are being bombarded with, that Christina was talking about. And I think it's really important to say, and I think Max said this as well, this is a very clearly orchestrated campaign, well oiled with millions in US Congress approved dollars. And, actually, since 2020, YouTubers and so-called social media influencers calling on Cubans to take to the street on a daily basis, but actually even some of them offering money, or listen to this, phone credit to go out and carry out violent acts of arson, of attacking police officers, and so on. So, we have to contextualize what happened in this reality, that this is the new contemporary manifestation of what we call the two-track policy. The Trump sanctions to increase economic asphyxiation on Cuba, alongside the social media war, the trying to galvanize intellectuals around the world, NGOs around the world, political institutions to condemn Cuba on the question of human rights and democracy and so on, trying to foster an internal opposition. This is the contemporary manifestation of the two-track solution. And the two-track policy is really clearly articulated by Lester Mallory in the famous memorandum. I keep repeating this because I do think it's important. Before the US blockade was first introduced, before the mass nationalizations by the Cuban state, which is often used as an excuse for the US sanctions against Cuba, Lester Mallory wrote on the 6th of April 1960, he said, the objective was regime change, and who was he? US Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for Inter-American Affairs. He recognized popular support for the revolutionary government and advised measures to weaken the economic life of Cuba. Why? To bring about hunger, desperation, and overthrow of government. And what we see today is 243 measures by the Trump administration that have stopped Cuba getting access to medical ventilators in the context of a global pandemic which affects the respiratory system. So, this is the cruelty. They've also, although Reid says remittances can come in, they've made it extraordinarily hard. They've attacked one major source of revenue for Cuba, which is the export of medical services overseas. Yes, this is a source of revenue for Cuba, but it is also a method of saving and improving lives around the world. The 13,000 Cuban doctors who were expelled or who were withdrawn from Brazil because the new president at that time, Bolsonaro, was making threatening statements about them, they have left behind tens of millions of Brazilians who no longer have access to medical assistance of any description, and they never did before. So, how long have I been speaking? I want to say something about the Cuban government's response, because we've talked, Max was talking about marginalized communities and recognizing, I think Christina talked about, those who are still suffering from the special period. And we have to recognize that with the collapse of the Soviet bloc, Cuba left economically and politically isolated. They had to introduce certain reforms and measures like the introduction of tourism, and this generates certain inequalities. And to the extent that it's possible, the Cuban government has used its control over the means of distribution and production to try and make sure no one is, as they say, left behind in Cuba. but you do have a situation where lots of people have moved up, as they do all over the world, from more rural areas, and they've set up in more precarious housing situations, in barrios, in neighborhoods on the edge, where the infrastructure and apparatus is weaker. And, you know, clearly Max was talking about how these programs are designed to use and manipulate those communities. But the response of the Cuban government is reminiscent of the response after the Elian Gonzalez incident, when the 6-year-old boy was, you know, shipwrecked, and his mother and I think 11 others died on a raft or on a faulty boat trying to leave Cuba at the end of the 1990s. And the government's response, led very much in a protagonistic way by Fidel Castro, was to say, we need to go into the barrios, we need to communicate with those people, we need to see what the situation is in every home, and we need to provide targeted assistance. And that's what we're seeing today. So Max mentioned the San Isidro movement. Well, that San Isidro movement gets its name from being an area in Havana. The president, Miguel Diaz-Canel, has gone down to that area with his ministers. They've been to all of the places, or they are going to all of the places in Cuba where there were protests which turned violent, or where there were protests. And they are really doing that process of talking to communities, not to parachute in and tell them to behave themselves, but to reinitiate a process of popular participation and integration into the revolutionary project. And, you know, it has been difficult because these political and economic spaces and cultural spaces have been closed down. But by the end of November, it's foreseen that the entire Cuban population should be fully vaccinated with free vaccine, including their childhood population. So children are now being vaccinated from 2 years and up in Cuba. And that will mean that they can open up those spaces again. So this has been a tough moment for Cuba. The intention, you know, what we saw was really just a tiny bit of success for a program of 60 years of regime change, the two-track program of economic asphyxiation to foster an internal opposition. And it's been, despite literally hundreds of millions, in fact, billions spent on regime change programs, it's had very little success to date. So tough times for Cuba, but the revolution has shown its resilience. What we need to do is understand that this is not just an attack on Cuba and the Cuban people. It is an attack on socialism as an idea and as an alternative, and the notion of socialist development. So in that sense, if you're committed to, you know, a world without exploitation, a world that can care for the planet and its population, then we are all invested in defending the Cuban Revolution. Thank you.
Viva Cuba. Thank you, Helen. Very inspiring speech. So